Well, good morning. It's great to be here today. I'm going to give a brief overview of the long-term cropping systems trial that we have going on in Minnesota. So we've heard a lot about crop rotations over the last day and a half. And one of the crop rotations rotational crops that I'd really like to emphasize are forage legumes and their importance in the cropping system, particularly alfalfa. And in the northern part of the U.S., generally what we say is that if you have a good stand of alfalfa and you terminate that, that's going to supply about all of the nitrogen you need for that first year of corn. And if you're in a conventional system and you have 2 years of corn after alfalfa, you're going to get half of the nitrogen you need for that second year of corn from that alfalfa crop. In addition, assuming that nitrogen is not limiting, there's also a potential to increase yield by having that forage legume in the rotation. One of the major advantages is that having that forage legume present helps break up pest cycles such as corn rootworm and weeds. Also, by having less tillage out there, because you got a perennial on the landscape, you have less tillage, so you have improved soil structure and tilth, less potential for erosion, and there's also reduced carbon losses from soil because there's less tillage. At the same time, there's root turnover, exudates from these roots, and there's leaf loss from the alfalfa during harvest that are returning to the soil organic matter pool. So there are a lot of benefits to having a forage legume in the crop rotation. However, short-term crop rotations dominate the Midwest that do not contain a forage legume. And the lost rotation effects, they're displaced with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. And these short-term high-input systems do produce high and stable crop yields. However, due to increased input costs and environmental concern, there is a lot of interest now in organic and low-input cropping systems. And in addition, the higher prices received by organic farmers also make organic cropping systems more attractive. In Minnesota, surveys of growers between 2006 and 2009 that are participating in the state's Farm Financial Management Program show that the prices that they receive for corn and soybean on average are about twice as high for organic farmers than they are for conventional farmers. In Minnesota, we're very fortunate to have a long-term cropping systems trial located at our Southwest Research and Outreach Center at Lamberton. This is a 40-acre experiment that was established in 1989, and the 30 years before that, it was managed by a low-input farmer. He had a 2-year corn-soybean rotation, no synthetic inputs of fertilizers or pesticides, and by the time the university took it over and prepared to get this long-term experiment on the land, it had a low soil test phosphorus, had a high weed seed bank. This long-term system basically is looking at a couple different factors. And the first one is crop rotation. In this system, we have a 2-year rotation, a 2-year corn-soybean rotation, and we're also comparing that to a 4-year rotation where we have oats underseeded with alfalfa, 1 full year of alfalfa production, a year of corn, and then soybean. And within each one of those different crops and within each of the rotations, we have 4 different management regimes. One is a zero-input system where the only external input is purchased seed. We also have a low-input system which uses synthetic fertilizer and pesticides but at reduced levels. Then we also have a high-input conventional system, and then we have an organic system. And each one of these management strategies is present within each crop and within each rotation in each year. It's replicated 3 times. Another thing that's interesting here that's important is that this is on a pattern-tiled, heavy clay loam soil. So this is a dark, rich, black, heavy clay soil. Very high yield potential, but it does create some challenges. In terms of the management strategies, I should first explain the different tillage systems that we have out there. The zero input, the high input, and the organic input systems, they're all using a pretty aggressive tillage system where we're using a moldboard plow in the fall after alfalfa and after corn. And we're using a chisel plow in the fall after soybeans, and then in the spring, the seedbeds are prepared with a finishing disc or a field cultivator. The low input system, however, is using a little bit of a less aggressive tillage system where there is no tillage in the fall after soybeans and a chisel plow replaces a moldboard plow after corn. In the zero input system, the only external input is purchased seed, and there's no manure, and weeds are controlled mechanically. In the low input system, we're using realistic yield goals to base the fertilizer recommendations on. The fertilizer is applied in bands near the row at planting, and the herbicide is also applied in a band, a 10-inch wide band over the row, and that's able to reduce total herbicide inputs in that system by 2/3. The high input system is typical of what we see in the landscape, where there are aggressive yield goals, broadcast synthetic fertilizers and herbicides. In the organic input system, it's organically managed, but we are managing for aggressive yield goals. Weed management. In the zero input and organic input systems, we're using a false seedbed approach, where we go in there in mid to late April with a field cultivator, go over the soil once with it to work it up, darken it up, facilitate some weed germination. Then we delay planting. We try to delay planting a little bit, about 9 days on average, to get a lot of these weed seeds to germinate. Then we come in, we hit it again with a field cultivator or finishing disc to destroy those weeds, and then get off to a start with our crop with less weed pressure. We also have, with the low input system, as I mentioned, we're using banded herbicides, but there's also one pass with the rotary hoe after planting, and then 2 passes with row cultivation. And in the high input system, there's broadcast herbicide and also 1 row cultivation. However, management has evolved over time in this experiment. Over time, as the optimum corn seeding rates have increased, we've also increased the seeding rates in this trial. Starting in 2004, in an attempt to emulate what growers are doing in the region, we adopted herbicide-tolerant corn and soybean varieties in the low input and the high input systems. At the same time, we adopted food-grade soybeans in the organic and zero input systems because that's what the organic growers were doing in our area. In 2005, corn rootworm moved in and started to become an issue in the region. So there was a decision made that in the low input and high input plots, that corn rootworm would be managed with soil insecticide or with BT hybrids. So what about the yields? Well, there's a couple things interesting that are going on here. First off, the response to crop management differed with rotation. In the 2-year rotation, we see that the zero input, which is in the blue bar, yielded the least, while the high input system yielded the most. In comparison, the low input and organic input systems in that 2-year rotation yielded 23 to 34% less, largely due to weeds in the organic system and to reduced fertility in the low input system. In the 4-year rotation, however, it didn't matter what we were doing. The low input, high input, and organic input systems all yielded the most on average. Another thing that's interesting is when we look at the rotation effect. So looking at the difference for a given management strategy between the 2 rotations. So if we're looking at the high input system, there was no advantage to the longer rotation. It was being offset by synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. However, the low input system, there was a 13% advantage to the longer rotation. For the organic input system, there was a 25% advantage to the longer rotation. And with the zero input system, there was a 41% advantage to the longer rotation, indicating that as you reduce the inputs going into the system, crop rotation becomes more important. But also we're showing that in the 4-year rotation that we're able to overcome the need for synthetic fertilizers and pesticides through the use of ecological practices and mechanical weed control. For soybean, what we found was that consistent, regardless of the management strategy that we were working with, there was a consistent 7% yield boost due to the longer rotation, likely due to fertility and better weed control. If we look at soybean yield, we can also look at it over the course of this 16-year trial. And we broke it down into 4-year cycles because one 4-year cycle represents one cycle of the 4-year rotation or 2 revolutions of the 2-year rotation. In the first 8 years of this study, the high input or the low input systems were yielding the most for soybean. And that was also true throughout throughout the entire 16 years, is that the high input and low input systems were yielding the most, while the organic and zero input systems were among the lowest yielding treatments throughout the study. Also, something that's interesting is that in the last 4 years, when we adopted the food grade soybean varieties, the yield difference between the organic and zero input systems versus the high input or low input systems was greater. Right? There's a bigger difference there in that last 4-year cycle because we were using food grade soybeans, which had a lower yield potential. So what about the economics? Well, we have a graduate student in Minnesota named Tim Delbridge, and he's working with Rob King, and they did a pretty extensive economic analysis on this trial that's been going on, and they were looking at a few of the systems involved. And to do an economic analysis, you have to make some general assumptions. One of the things that they tried to do was make this as relevant as possible by using 2006 to 2009 input and commodity prices and applying them to all the data from all of the years of this trial so that this is something that growers can grab onto and have it be relevant. In addition, another challenge was trying to come up with what is the cost of the manure. There was a lot of debate on how to do this, and in the end it was decided that the nutrients available in the manure would be charged the same price as those for synthetic fertilizers. Also, no organic premiums were given to alfalfa hay or to the oat straw. There's a couple interesting things that are going on here. If you just look at the top half of this table, we're looking at the difference between the 2-year and 4-year rotations under the high input strategy with conventional prices. And what we see is that the 2-year rotation was more profitable than the 4-year, likely because the 4-year isn't really a realistic scenario, right? Because we only had 1 full year of alfalfa production, and a grower who's going to grow alfalfa is likely going to have at least 2, if not 4 years of full years of alfalfa production so that he can amortize that cost of establishing the alfalfa over time. The other thing that's interesting is look at the difference between the high input 4-year rotation and the organic 4-year rotation in terms of net return. There's no difference when the organic system is given conventional prices. However, when the 4-year organic system is given 50% of the premiums or 100% of the organic premiums for corn and soybean, now the organic system trumps the conventional system in terms of economic return. Another thing to think about is how variable are those net returns, and that is shown in the far right-hand column where the standard deviation is. So that's kind of a measure of the amount of variability in these net returns. And we see that in the conventional systems, the standard deviation is relatively small in comparison to the size of the net return. But then when we move to the organic systems, the standard deviation is a much larger proportion of the total net return, indicating the greater variability in, first off, the yields in organic systems, but then also in the management required for organic systems based on the number of tillage classes and whatnot. There was another student in Minnesota named Maya Kiritomi who worked with Deborah Allen to look at a bunch of different soil quality parameters. And one of them that I chose to show today is particulate organic matter carbon. So particulate organic matter, it's the sand-sized organic material. It's related to recent changes in agronomics, things like tillage, rotation, manure, and it's an indicator of soil quality. And it's also an early indicator of future changes in total organic carbon. And what we find here is that just looking at the top 3 inches of the soil, that particulate organic matter carbon was much higher with organic management in both the 2-year and 4-year rotations than in the other crop management systems. Also, if we just look at the 2-year system, the 2-year rotation, the low input system there that used less aggressive tillage had a mediocre level in terms of particulate organic matter carbon. So we did get a boost in particulate organic matter carbon, likely due to the manure involved in the organic system. And then we've seen that in the 2-year system where we're using less aggressive tillage that the palm carbon was kind of at an intermediate level. And again, we see this same general trend when we look at the depth of 3 to 8 inches where there was much higher soil quality with the organic system than the other ones, likely due to the use of manure. Another study that was done related to this long-term trial was one that was looking at water quality and drainage. So as I mentioned earlier, that these are heavy clay loam soils. They have pattern tiled drains on them. And there was a student named Carrie Oquist who worked with Jeff Strock at the Lamberton Research Station. And what they did is they did a farm comparison on drainage and then water quality of that drainage water. So they looked at the farm that had this long-term cropping systems trial on it. It's about a 136-acre farm, 136 acres of actual cropland, and that had the 40-acre cropping systems experiment in it. It also had anywhere between 30 and 40 acres each of corn, soybeans, small grain, and then it had about 14 to 19 acres of native grass and alfalfa. So in this 136 acres, there's a lot of research going on, looking at organic systems, low input systems, a lot of work there in those type of alternative practices. Right across the fence line on the research farm, we have another 130 acres where we do our conventional high input corn soybean type of research. And on that piece of ground, between 2002 and 2004, on average there was about 77 acres of corn, 48 acres of soybeans. Well, what about water quality and drainage? Well, during the growing season between 2002 and 2004, on the farm that was managed conventionally, there was about 4.6 inches of drainage water leaving that land. In comparison, on a farm with alternative management practices, cumulative total drainage during the growing season was 15 to 57% less. So less water is leaving the farm under alternative management. More importantly, let's look at the nutrient concentrations in that water that's leaving the field. In terms of nitrate nitrogen in that drainage water, under the farm under conventional management, that was at 17.2 parts per million, which is much higher than the 10 part per million drinking water standard. In comparison, on the alternative farm, the nitrate nitrogen levels in that water were 47 to 59% less. They averaged only 8.2 parts per million. But that's still much higher than what many of us would like. And that's a challenge on these heavy, productive prairie-derived soils that have high nitrogen mineralization potential, is getting low nitrate nitrogen levels consistently, even under alternative management. Also, if we look at total phosphorus in that drainage water, we see that conventional had 0.05 milligrams per liter in that water, and under alternative management, it was anywhere between 0 to 50% less. So less water was leaving under the farm that was under alternative management, and it had significantly less nitrate in that water, and a little bit less phosphorus as well. So some general conclusions here. We've demonstrated in our trial the results of having an extended crop rotation for corn and soybean. That high corn and soybean yields can be obtained with organic and or low input cropping systems. We've shown that the organic corn and soybean production is economically competitive and that it can enhance soil and water quality. However, there is future research that is needed. One of them is to be able to increase soybean yield under organic production. As you remember from one of my previous slides, I showed that our organic soybean yields were always consistently less than those under low or high input systems. In addition, in the northern part of the U.S., where it tends to be colder, where we have, especially in areas where we have heavy soils, there's a challenge for us to be able to maintain yield and weed control with less tillage. So those are some things that would be great if we could work on and improve that. So thank you.